No one in Whoville knew it that night. No one heard the crunch of snow beneath his green feet, nor the harsh sound of his restrained breathing as he descended the mountain. No one imagined that, at the highest point of the world, among cold caves and echoes that seemed to whisper his name, a creature tired of belonging decided to see something they believed he could never touch: Christmas. And there he is, at the darkest point of his legend, moving silently among lights and garlands, stealing gifts, ripping trees out by the roots, turning off plastic stars like someone extinguishing the few good memories they have left. That is the moment where the story usually begins for most people, the villain's glorious instant at his peak, when there is no turning back, when the shadow has become so comfortable it almost feels like home. But that is the greatest lie of all. No villain is born at the peak of their ruin. To understand a monster, you must first see him before the roar, before the rage, before the accumulated pain that pushed him to devour himself. And so we go back, as if life were an old tape someone rewinds carefully. Not to justify, but to observe where it all began. Because in reality, the story of the Grinch is not the story of a Christmas thief. It is the story of someone who tried to belong until he stopped trying. Talking about the Grinch is talking about a child who was never seen as a child in anyone's eyes. His life begins at that strange and tragic point where existence throws you into the world without asking your opinion, placing you in arms that do not always know what to do with you. They found him in a box, among snowflakes that seemed too cold for someone so small. A green baby, different, wrinkled by the cold and by that silent destiny some seemed to carry even before opening their eyes. It wasn't that he was weird, he was different. And in a world that fears what is different, that difference is enough to write a prophecy of loneliness. From the beginning, his laugh sounded strange. His gestures seemed exaggerated, his skin too green. Adults looked at him with uncomfortable tenderness, like someone trying to love something they don't fully understand. The children, on the other hand, were more honest. They laughed, pointed at him, mimicked his voice. And they didn't do it out of pure malice, but because of that raw instinct humans have when we see something that disrupts our order. Sometimes cruelty is not born from hate, but from fear. And fear, when repeated enough, becomes habit. And habit, when normalized, becomes a system. That is how a villain is built. With small daily mockeries, with looks that weigh too much, with silences that say more than any insult. But there was light in that child. A clumsy, intense, somewhat chaotic light. He liked to assemble things, to build small, useless inventions that sometimes exploded and other times made funny sounds. He liked them because in them he found control, something no one could take from him, something that finally made sense. He also liked to watch the snow fall. He said each snowflake had a different story, and none was like the other. Maybe he saw himself reflected in them. Maybe he thought that if snow could be unique without being judged, maybe he could too. Here I pause to reflect on something we have all felt, that deep desire to be accepted, even when we promised ourselves we don't care. How fragile we are as children. How a single word, a single mockery, a single laugh pointed at us can forever shape the way we see ourselves. Sometimes the first emotional wound is not caused by something big, but by something small, almost imperceptible. A "why are you like this" that sticks like a thorn. A "how weird" repeated enough times to become identity. And when we realize it, we have become the creature we believe others see.
The Grinch grew up in that environment, loved but misunderstood, present but never fully welcomed. And although he tried to ignore it, although he tried to be part of the other children, there was something that constantly reminded him of his difference: Christmas. Because while everyone celebrated, sang, surrounded themselves with bright colors and deafening laughter, he saw his reflection in the golden ornaments and found that strange face he still didn't know how to love. I remember that particular scene that marked his life. The first Christmas in which he truly tried to fit in. He wanted to make a gift. He wanted to be part of something the whole world seemed to adore. He worked on it for hours, shaping a small ornament. He made it with his own hands, with clumsy tenderness, with hope. And hope, when it is pure, hurts if it breaks. That very morning, amid laughter and celebrations, someone mocked his appearance, the way he tried to fix himself, his shy smile. They didn't laugh at the ornament, they laughed at him. The adults ignored it, already used to the idea that children are cruel and don't mean bad. But they do, and what's worse, they learn it from us. In that moment, the Grinch understood that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as a mistake. His first gift, the one he had created with hope, lay on the floor, and he, with his face red from embarrassment and his eyes brimming, ran into the snow. That was the day Christmas stopped being a celebration and became an open wound. Every villain has an exact date of birth, and it doesn't always match their birthday. For the Grinch, it was born that Christmas. Here I want to stop again, because that moment is not only his. We have all had an instant where we discovered, perhaps too early, that the world doesn't always have space for us. That day when we stop trying to fit in and start building walls. Not because we want to be cold, but because we need to protect something that has already been hurt too many times. And when we build walls too high, we end up believing we can live alone. Sometimes we even want to. But loneliness, when it becomes a habit, hardens the heart in a silent and dangerous way. The Grinch grew up far away in the mountain, not because he was a monster, but because the world convinced him he was. He took with him his inventions, his strange noises, his wit, his pain. And from afar, he watched people celebrate every year that thing he had learned to hate. Not because he was evil, but because it was a brutal reminder that he never belonged. Christmas for him wasn't a holiday, it was a scar. And so, little by little, the curious child became a sullen adult who filled his cave with echoes and noisy machines so he wouldn't have to listen to the silence of loneliness. The Grinch didn't leave because he hated the Whos. He left because he hated himself whenever he was near them. Time passed, as it does for everyone, without asking permission, without stopping to measure whether you have healed or whether you are still broken. And while in Whoville, the celebration repeated itself year after year like a sacred ritual, on the top of the mountain, the anger grew like a weed, a silent anger, accumulated, made of all the times he felt invisible, of all the moments in which he tried to be part of something and was pushed away without anyone noticing. An anger that did not ask for destruction, but for meaning. The kind of anger that does not seek to hurt others, but to prove that you exist too. And so we return to the beginning, to that night when the Grinch decided that if Christmas had taken so much from him, he would take something from it too. He did not do it to hurt others. He did it so that for once in his life, the world would feel his presence. Because even the deepest pain sometimes seeks to become echo, noise, something others cannot ignore.
And there we see him again, at his peak, stealing Christmas while everyone sleeps. But now, after knowing his origin, his figure changes. He is no longer a monster. He is no longer a villain. He is a wounded child inside an adult body, desperately trying to pull out the last thorn that has been stuck inside him for years. Because when society destroys you, it does not always do it with screams. Sometimes it does it with laughter, and that laughter hurts more. And so, while Whoville slept under a thick blanket of snow, something deeper than a robbery was happening at the top of the mountain. The Grinch was not only taking trees, ornaments, and gifts, he was tearing out by the root a wound he had spent years trying to ignore. Each box he threw into the sack was an unreturned memory. Each ornament he made disappear was a fragment of a past that haunted him even in his dreams. To the eyes of the world, that night would become his greatest crime. But for him,
It was an act of liberation, a strange, twisted but deeply human ritual, destroying what has caused you the most pain, even when the pain does not come from the object, but from the memory attached to it. Let us imagine for a moment his trembling hands as he touched a shining ornament. They do not tremble from fear of being caught. They tremble because in its distorted reflection, he sees himself. And that is the hardest image for anyone to face. The truth of what we have been, of what we are, of what we never managed to overcome. Humans, and yes, even a being like the Grinch, do not fear the outer darkness as much as they fear the inner one. That darkness that feeds on silences, on memories, on unspoken words. A darkness that does not need shadow to exist. As he kept stealing, he remembered, and remembering is a double-edged sword. It can save you, or it can destroy you. He remembered that Christmas at school, the one in which he tried to be like the others. He remembered the clumsy ornament made with his green hands, the laughter, the shame, the loneliness that dragged him to the mountain. He remembered how each year he watched everything from afar, trying to convince himself that he didn't care. But of course he cared. What we try hardest to deny is usually what hurts us most. It is at that point where it is worth pausing and thinking about something universal. How many times have we pretended that something doesn't affect us when it is actually breaking us inside? How many times have we repeated, "I don't care, it doesn't matter, I don't feel anything anymore," when the truth is we are just avoiding facing the pain? There are wounds that don't cry, but bleed on the inside. And when we ignore them for too long, they rot in silence until they transform us. The Grinch, like many of us, became the result of all those accumulated wounds. But he also became something else, an uncomfortable mirror of what we can become when we let the world define our worth. He didn't want to destroy Christmas. He wanted to destroy the version of himself that Christmas reminded him of. That excluded, ridiculed, rejected version. That version that was never enough for others. And so he continued, street by street, house by house. His footsteps were barely heard on the wooden floors, but inside him they echoed like blows. There was a strange and beautiful contrast that night. The town flooded with darkened lights, and him wrapped in shadows, moving with the agility of someone who does not steal out of malice, but out of emotional habit, as if each movement had been rehearsed for years, as if stealing Christmas had always been his destiny.
But there was a moment, a small one, almost imperceptible, that marked the beginning of the change. A soft sound, a voice. Cindy Lou. That little girl who, without knowing it, became the first ray of light to touch the Grinch's heart in years. She did not scream when she saw him. She did not step back. She did not point at him with fear or mockery. She looked at him. Just that. She saw him. As if he were not a monster, nor a mistake, nor a horror legend. As if he were someone. And here I pause again, because this scene deserves deep reflection. Sometimes in life, we don't need grand heroic acts to begin healing. Sometimes it is enough for someone to truly look at us, for someone to see us, without judgment, without fear, without prejudice. Humans are made of invisible connections, small gestures that can save us without the other person even realizing it. A sincere look can disarm years of accumulated pain. And although the Grinch did not know it at that moment, that encounter planted the first seed of transformation within him. Still, he went on. The wound was too deep to heal with a single look. And so he carried his bags until the whole town was empty.
It was the first Christmas in the history of Whoville without lights, without music, without gifts, without anything. The Grinch from afar looked at his completed work like a sculptor observing his final creation. It was a dark triumph, yes, but a triumph nonetheless. And yet, something in his chest remained empty. Something still hurt. Because anger, even when you feed it, does not fill. It only wears you out. Dawn arrived with a gray, almost metallic sky. And from his mountain, the Grinch was ready to enjoy the sound he believed inevitable. The crying, the complaints, the sadness of the entire town. That moment when the world would finally feel what he felt for so many years. But when the sun rose and the snow began to shine softly, he heard it. And it wasn't crying. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't rage. It was singing. A soft, united, sincere singing. The people of Whoville held hands and sang even without gifts, without ornaments, without trees. They sang because their Christmas wasn't made of things, but of themselves. It was something deeper, more human, more essential. And that singing reached the top of the mountain like an inevitable truth. The Grinch froze. His plan, his anger, his vengeance, everything cracked in a second, because what he heard made no sense to him. How could they sing? How could they celebrate without the things he had taken from them? How could they be happy without what he never had? A silence emerged inside him, a silence unlike any he had felt before. It wasn't the cold silence of loneliness. It was a reflective, uncomfortable, revealing silence, a silence that forces you to look within. And then he understood something that hit him harder than all the mockery of his childhood. They didn't celebrate because of the objects. They celebrated because of the bond, because of the connection between them. Something he had never had. Something he had always secretly longed for. That discovery was the beginning of the greatest emotional collapse of his life. Because when the truth catches up to you, it doesn't matter how much you've built to protect yourself. The walls fall. And when they fall, you are left standing before yourself with no defense. The Grinch felt something he had not felt since he was a child. True sadness. Not anger disguised as sadness, not frustration disguised as strength. Pure sadness. The kind that reveals that the problem was never Christmas, but the way he distanced himself from the world to avoid being hurt again.
Here I pause again, because this moment connects with something deep and universal. All of us, at some point in our lives, confuse protection with isolation. We believe that locking ourselves away in our inner mountain will make us stronger, more invulnerable. But all it does is deprive us of what we need most, a real bond. When we avoid pain, we also avoid love. When we avoid rejection, we also avoid acceptance. And when we avoid the world, we end up amputating ourselves from the humanity that sustains us. The Grinch's heart, they say, grew 3 times its size that morning. But that metaphor doesn't speak of magic. It speaks of something real. The human ability to transform when the truth touches us. The change didn't come through a miracle, but through an emotional confrontation. He recognized his pain, his loneliness, his anger. He recognized that he had built an entire identity based on the rejection of others. And when he admitted it, even for an instant, something inside him broke, and something new began to form. Then, in an act that seemed impossible, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He decided to return everything he had stolen, not because he feared punishment, nor because he wanted to redeem himself before the town, but because he discovered that what he had been searching for since he was a child was not the material Christmas, but the emotional meaning that came with it. For the first time, he wanted to approach that warmth he had always observed from afar. But the decision was not easy. Imagine his dilemma. Coming down the mountain meant exposing himself again.
It meant facing judgment, rejection, the fear of being seen once more as the monster he believed himself to be. That moment when he is about to descend, carrying the overflowing sleigh, is not an act of heroic bravery. It is an act of vulnerability. And vulnerability, in its purest form, is the bravest act a being can commit. What happens next, and which we will explore better in the last part, is the beginning of a deep reconciliation, not with the town, but with himself. Because before being accepted by others, the Grinch had to learn to accept himself. And that journey, that process, is one we all know, one we all live in some way, in silence, in our own inner mountains. The Grinch's transformation was not Christmas magic, it was humanity. It was pain turned into understanding. It was loneliness transformed into connection. And it was the recognition that even when society destroys you, the greatest enemy, and also the greatest savior, is always within oneself. When the Grinch came down the mountain, he did so with a heart still trembling. He didn't know what awaited him. He didn't know if the town would scream, if they would run, if they would accuse him, if they would lock him inside the identity he had reinforced for years. Every step toward Whoville was a reminder of the child he once was, small, insecure, wounded. And yet, there he was, facing the one thing that had always frightened him more than loneliness, the possibility of not being accepted. The sleigh slid down the mountain without the fury of its earlier descent. It was a different journey, a journey toward the truth. And when he reached the center of town, dragging bags, ornaments, trees, gifts, the silence was absolute. Not one of fear, but one of surprise, of bewilderment, of humanity contained. He who for years had been a shadow to them was now there in broad daylight, vulnerable, exposed, breathing deeply, like someone removing an armor that has grown too old.
And then the unexpected happened. Instead of screams, he heard small footsteps. Cindy Lou stepped forward with that innocence that breaks walls effortlessly. She lifted her gaze and hugged him, without permission, without fear, without judgment. A gesture so simple, but one that changed his entire story. The other inhabitants watched her. They looked at the Grinch. They looked at the sleigh. They looked at their own fears, their prejudices, their memories of that green child they never knew how to understand. And little by little, that solitary hug became a symbol, one that silently said, "We have all been misunderstood at some point." Because it is easy to judge someone's shell without asking what lies inside. It is easy to point at the villain without asking who turned them into one. It is easy to forget that we all carry invisible scars, wounds no one else saw, pains no one else heard. And in that instant, Whoville remembered something essential, that humanity, even in its strangest form, is always worthy of understanding. The Grinch, clumsy and bewildered, dropped some of the bags. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say. No one had hugged him like that since he was a baby. And for a moment, his hands, always tense, always defensive, relaxed. That gesture opened the door for others to come closer, not as judges, not as victims, as equals, as beings who had also made mistakes, who had also hurt others unintentionally, who had also been through dark moments. And so, as he returned each ornament, each sphere, each box, he was not only giving back what he had taken, he was returning himself. He was returning to his original story, to the version of himself that remained trapped in childhood. He was reconnecting with that green child whom everyone hurt without understanding.
A child that didn't need to be perfect or fit in or be like the others. He only needed to feel seen. The celebration that followed wasn't just another Christmas. It was the Grinch's first Christmas. One he didn't watch from the mountain or from a shadow or from a wound. One he lived from the inside. A Christmas where the sound of laughter no longer hurt him, but wrapped around him. Where the light didn't burn him, but illuminated him. Where he discovered, perhaps for the first time, that belonging isn't stolen or demanded. It's offered, built, and cultivated. And so he finally understood something many of us take years to realize, that it isn't society that decides our destiny. It's us who, even with the wounds left upon us, have the power to choose who we want to become. That even if society can break us, we can still rebuild ourselves. That even if the world labels us as villains, we can reinvent ourselves into something different. That even evil, when you look closely, is often just accumulated pain searching for a way out. The Grinch found his way out, and it wasn't by stealing Christmas, it was by returning it, by coming back to the world that once pushed him away, by daring to let himself be embraced, by allowing the light to reach him, by understanding that healing isn't forgetting, but transforming. And that is, in the end, the universal lesson hidden in his story, that we all carry a Grinch inside, a wounded, lonely, sometimes bitter part. And we all also carry a Whoville inside, a place that sings even in loss, that finds joy even in absence, that has the ability to forgive even what once felt unforgivable. What is truly human is allowing both sides to speak, letting the wound meet compassion, letting fear meet empathy, letting darkness make room for light.
The Grinch didn't change because Christmas was magical. He changed because he chose to open himself to something he had avoided his entire life: connection. And this is where the story stops being a Christmas tale and becomes a mirror. Because in the end, we all need the same things: to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, to be loved, even with the parts of ourselves we still don't understand. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is the true essence of this biography. Not the story of a villain who stole Christmas, not the story of a monster who turned good, but the story of a being who, like all of us, had to descend to the deepest part of his loneliness to find the path back to himself. A story that reminds us that even when society destroys you, there is always the possibility to rebuild, and that even if the world turns you into a villain, you still have the power to decide who you'll become next. And if this story made you think, if it stirred something inside you, even a little, I invite you to subscribe. Here, we tell different stories. Stories that look at the villain and find the human behind them. Leave a like. Though it may seem small, it helps more people find these reflections. And tell me in the comments, do you think the Grinch was born evil, or was he made that way? Where does evil truly begin? I'll be reading you, always, and I'll see you in the next part.